right, so moving forward with the phases. So I'd like to touch upon the third phase, because I think it was kind of fundamental in a sense that this phase was kind of based on three groups of devices, right? And you mentioned one type of devices were kind of based on speech sound for fingers, right? Projecting. And then the other group would be projecting actual images via vibration of the skin. And the third group of devices was based on Morse code, like arbitrary haptic symbols. So essentially, we see kind of like a birth or foundation of haptic language as we know it now, right? So my question is the following. Does the contemporary tactile language have any alternatives, or maybe new principles and semantics appeared in comparison to this third wave?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and it depends on where you're asking it, right? So if you are asking it in the research lab, I think maybe you have some established principles there. If you're asking it in the consumer space, I think it's a little bit we're still in that throwing stuff against the wall phase, right? We keep seeing companies try to develop more robust tactile languages, right? We have simple vibration notification systems that are fairly intelligible, but whenever companies have tried to develop more nuanced tactile languages, they seem to have fallen short. And I'm thinking of like efforts by Apple with the Haptic engine. I'm thinking of efforts by Immersion with its instinctive alerts. So any attempt at layering, sort of a formalized vocabulary onto computer-generated tactile sensations seems to fall fairly well short. And we're left with, I think still in 2022, we're left with a very simple language of, notification vibrations. That again, depending on the device might send you a more complex signal. The question is if you read that signal, right? So
that's the question, exactly. Are we closer to understanding our body, the skin, in terms of projecting another type of language to it, or we are not there yet? So we can project anything we want, right? But we need to project something that body, our skin interface can understand. But to do that, we need to understand this skin interface first. So
yeah, I mean, this is where I think it's helpful to look back at, especially the work done in the 50s and 60s around tactile communication. The foundation was all there at that point in terms of discerning or identifying discernible tactile characters. The question was really one of training and willingness of people to submit themselves to the sort of complex training that it would take to decode these tactile messages. And I think that's the real challenge, right? Like if my phone or my watch vibrates and it sends me a message that I have an incoming call from my dad or an incoming call from my wife, and those are two different messages, materially distinguishable messages, and I don't read them as distinct messages, does it matter that they're materially distinct? And this really gets at the cultural aspect of this project, right? Like, to what extent are people willing to learn those new tactile languages? I think that's a really fascinating question. I think we've learned them sort of tacitly, but not explicitly in a lot of cases, right? So I understand pretty well the different notifications that come from my smartwatch, but I never learned them formally, right? Like I never.
But that's the thing. Do we need to learn? Because if we're talking about the real touch, right, the real tactile sensation, we don't need to learn anything. We perceive it on the go, right? It's so natural to us. It's like it's connected to our emotions, right? So can we do something like this? We're mediated touch, using mediated touch technologies. So here I'm just thinking, is there is another set of set of language, which is not even called a language, because the moment we call something language, it requires training and learning and all that. Headache. So can we go around this headache and make it so intuitive using mediated touch? So is there a way? is there opportunity for that? It's kind of a rhetorical question. I'm not asking.
I mean, so I think
it's something that I'm very curious in my research. So, because initially I was so much motivated by the fact that real tactile sense is so powerful in conveying information quickly and not simple information, because if we are talking about notion of emotion, it's a very complex, abstract information, but via tactile sense, we can do it very quickly. But if we take mediated touch technology or language, tactile language, that's going to become very cumbersome. So bridging these two is the question that I'm always wondering about. So I was curious.
I mean, I think that what this comes down to, and it's really like it's very fundamental, is the question of where does instinct come from, right? And is there such a thing as biological instinct, and if so, you know, how significant is that, and how much of instinct is learned, right? So you know, immersion certainly thought with its instinctive alerts that it had identified, you know, instinctive tactile characters that would not need to be learned. I didn't agree with that. I thought that was a lot of sort of marketing rhetoric. But I, you know, I think a lot of this depends on your orientation, you know, toward that question of nature versus nurture. How much of our tactile vocabulary is learned, but learned so early that we don't think of it as learned, so that it just appears as instinct.
So it's about the time, like the duration of training, basically. How can we minimize it in a way?
Yeah, and also reflecting on where things that we think are instinctive might have come from, like to what extent those things that appear instinctive, that appear natural, are a result of cultural training or are a result of learning. And if you go back to Weber, it's really fascinating. In his book, he basically talks about that process of learning to distinguish tactile sensations from one another. He thinks that is something that happens so early on in our development that we forget it ever happened. So it looks natural, but it is actually developmental, and it's learned. But it's learned so early on that we forget that it's learned. It's a really fascinating approach to, you know, to that question of what is inherent and what is learned, what's involved, what involves training, what involves learning, and what involves, you know. And again, like if we take this back, the premise of Robert Galt's teletactor was basically the brain is plastic, that if you just brute force these sound sensations through the hand long enough, eventually your brain will start interpreting those tactile sensations as speech sounds, right? So there's sort of a theory of learning baked into the like design and ideation of all these technologies that I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, plasticity of brain and stuff. It all the question how much effort you want to put into it and why, right? What's the reason for that?